Greetings, everyone, and welcome to all of you from us here at the Vedanta Society of New York. We are very happy that you've been able to join us for this very special talk by Swami Medhananda, who will speak on his recently published book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. The Swami is a monk of the Ramakrishna order and senior research fellow in philosophy at the Ramakrishna Institute of Moral and Spiritual Education in Mysore, India. His highly acclaimed book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, was published to great acclaim in 2018. Right now, I'll hand off to Swamisava Priyananda, who would like to say a few words himself.
Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchid Sukha Swarupaya Swami Netapaharine. It gives me a special pleasure to welcome you all to this very unique, significant and special book talk, marking the launch of Ayan Maharaj's latest book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. I just wanted to say that it was always a dream of mine that we should have first-class, world-standard academic works on Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, the Holy Mother. The teachings are so rich, so profound, and so deep that they really deserve world-class recognition. I mean, I wanted books on Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, which would be studied at Harvard, Yale, and Oxford, Cambridge, and all the top universities of the world. And that really happened with Ayan Maharaj's first book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. I actually saw the book at the offices of at least a couple of professors at Harvard University, in the philosophy department, in the divinity school. Ayan Maharaj is perfectly suited for this work. He has been rigorously trained in the best institutes of the world in philosophy, in critical thinking. He has studied at the University of California in Berkeley, at Oxford University and Humboldt University in Germany. He has been thoroughly trained in Indian philosophy, especially in Vedanta. He is a rigorous scholar. He believes in going to the originals, to the Sanskrit texts in their original, Bengali texts in their original. I know that he studied Pali to study the Theravada Buddhist texts in their original. I know that and I just confirmed that he actually studied Danish to read the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard in the original. He's a monk, and a wonderful monk. I've known him for more than a decade now, and I have seen him to be a very austere, very focused, sincere spiritual seeker with very strong monastic values. So this makes him the perfect person to write these books on Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and hopefully sometime in the future one on the Holy Mother. He's the practitioner academic par excellence. So we look forward to this book, and Ayan Maharaj, take it away. It's your platform now. Thank you.
Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamini Tapaharini. It's a pleasure and an honor to be speaking to all of you today. Okay, so the book is, as Diane mentioned, is called Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. It was supposed to be published on January 6th, 2022, but because of the pandemic, the publication has been delayed by a couple months. So now it should be published in the US first on March 8th, 2022. And I'll mention at the very end of the presentation that Oxford is also coming out with a South Asian edition that's going to be sold in India and other South Asian countries about a month after that. So most likely toward the end of April. So for people living in South Asia, they can purchase that edition. Okay, so what I plan to do is give an overview of each of the 10 chapters. It's a 10-chapter book. It's about 425 pages. And it's an academic book, remember, so this is not very easygoing. So I'm going to give an overview of the chapters one by one, but it's by no means comprehensive. I'm going to be leaving most of the book out simply because that's the reason why I wrote the book, right? It's not a lecture. So in a lecture, lectures are a kind of limited medium, but I'll do my best to just highlight some of the main arguments and ideas that are present in each of the chapters. And hopefully this presentation will entice you to go out and buy the book or find the book in a library and read it yourself. So that's the hope. And then I look forward to hearing your questions. So first, let me just explain the overall structure of the book. So I mentioned that there are 10 chapters. The book is divided into 4 parts. So each part concerns a different theme. So part 1 concerns what I call integral Advaita. That's how I characterize the philosophy of Swami Vivekananda. And so the first 3 chapters concern the topic of his philosophy of integral Advaita. I'll be explaining them one by one shortly, but I'm just giving you an overview first. Part 2, comprising chapters 4 through 6, concerns the experiential basis of religion. So all of these chapters discuss how Swami Vivekananda grounds religion not in dogma, but in spiritual experience and the philosophical issues and complexities that are involved in his attempt to do that and to establish religion as a science in its own right. Part 3 concerns faith and reason. This is one of the most important topics in the philosophy of religion. And chapter 7 discusses his views on the powers and limits of reason. And chapter 8 concerns his views on faith. And he has some really original ideas about religious faith, which I'll talk about. And finally, fourth and finally, part 4 concerns consciousness. This is a very hot topic in philosophy of mind. Swami Sarvapriyananda talks about it a lot in his lectures, the hard problem of consciousness. So how does Swamiji solve the hard problem of consciousness? What are his arguments in favor of his approach to consciousness? That's what chapters 9 and 10 concern. And then there's an epilogue. So first, the introduction of the book. In this introduction, I kind of lay out the methodology. Now, one second, I have to move this. Your photos are blocking part of the screen. How do I shift it? Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. Okay, so introduction. So for over 100 years, there's been scholarship, quite an abundant scholarship on Vivekananda's philosophy, both in India and in the past few decades, also in the West. And if I were to characterize the kind of 2 main approaches to Swamiji's philosophy, I would say the following, that the first main approach that many people adopt is they say that Swami Vivekananda was a modern exponent of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. That he's basically following Shankara's Advaita philosophy, but that he's adding some modern touches. The second approach among scholars is quite different, and scholars beginning with Paul Hacker, a German scholar, but there are many people who were inspired by his approach, and they make similar arguments. They claim that Vivekananda was a so-called neo-Vedantin. And what they mean by that is it's a Vedanta that's not homegrown. It's not rooted primarily in Indian traditions, but actually in Western traditions. And they say that it's only after he visited the West that he started kind of teaching a Vedanta that was inflected by certain ideas from Schopenhauer and other Western thinkers. It seems to me, and this is what I argue in the course of my book, but especially in the introduction, it seems to me that both of these approaches, these dominant approaches, overlook Swamiji's originality and agency as a philosophical thinker. So why agency? People who say that he's just following Shankara, I think that they're really robbing Swamiji of a lot of originality, because Shankara has said all that needs to be said about philosophy and spirituality. Swamiji is just a kind of late follower. And the Neo-Vedanta approach, they're obsessed with this idea that he was influenced by X, Y, and Z trends or thinkers in the West, but that's robbing him of agency, right? The idea is that Swamiji himself was an agential philosophical thinker, which means that he was capable of sort of assimilating and critically engaging ideas from both India and the West, and did so in an active manner, not in a passive way, like, like a billiard stick, hits a ball on a pool table, right? He's not just passive, he's actually agential as a philosophical thinker. So rejecting both of these dominant interpretive approaches, my book argues that Vivekananda is best seen as a cosmopolitan Vedantin who developed distinctive new philosophical positions through creative and critical engagement with thinkers in both Indian and Western philosophical traditions. So this is the main reason why I call the book Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. He is not just an Indian thinker. He's also not a neo-Vedantin. He was a very active and critical philosophical thinker working in a kind of global intellectual landscape where he would take ideas from any country wherever he found them. The next question is, so if you study the literature within philosophy and political theory on cosmopolitanism, there are many different kinds of cosmopolitanism. And in my introduction, I draw on Janardhan Ganeri's essay published in his edited volume, The Oxford Handbook of Indian Philosophy. He wrote an article called The Immersive Cosmopolitanism of K.C. Bhattacharya, who was a younger contemporary of Swami Vivekananda. And by the way, many of you probably watched his lecture in Sarvapriyananda Center. That lecture that he gave in Sarvapriyananda Center was based on that essay, the essay that I'm drawing from in my introduction. According to Ganeri, K.C. Bhattacharya's what he calls immersive cosmopolitanism has three main features. The first is a reverential but critical immersion in the Indian tradition. So Ganeri calls this an immersive cosmopolitanism because it's not a radically unrooted cosmopolitanism. It's not saying I don't belong to any tradition. You remain grounded in the Indian tradition, but you don't just dogmatically sort of assume some particular philosophy within the Indian tradition. You actively plant yourself in a particular Indian tradition. That's what he means by reverential but critical immersion in the Indian tradition. Second, this is an important aspect as well of his cosmopolitanism. The uncritical acceptance of Western ideas amounts to a form of intellectual slavery. So K.C. Bhattacharya's essay was called tellingly, this lecture was called Swaraj and Ideas. Swaraj, of course, having the political connotations of, it's both political freedom and also how our political subjugation under the British is reflected in a kind of intellectual slavery. And one of the main forms of intellectual slavery is just passively accepting ideas from the West and assuming that they're superior to Indian ideas. So that's something that you have to be very careful about. And that's something that K.C. Bhattacharya warned against. And that's also something I see very strongly in Swamiji. He was very critical of people, of Indian thinkers who would just sort of passively and uncritically accept Western ideas. And the third main aspect of K.C. Bhattacharya's immersive cosmopolitanism, according to Ganeri, is that Indian philosophers should practice what he called, what K.C. Bhattacharya called vital assimilation, a dialectical engagement with Western views that combines receptive openness with critical scrutiny. So it's not just passive acceptance, but really critically thinking about the Western ideas, maybe taking aspects of them and rejecting other aspects like that. And I give a lot of evidence in the introduction. I'm only giving two pieces of evidence here to indicate that I think that Swami Vivekananda was very much, and prior to K.C. Bhattacharya, an immersive cosmopolitan philosopher. So these are two statements of his. I belong as much to India as to the world. No humbug about that. So as most of you probably know, cosmopolitanism, etymologically, it means a citizen of the world or a citizen of the universe. And so this is exactly what Swamiji is affirming in these kinds of statements. And the second statement, my motto is to learn whatever is great wherever I may find it. So whether he finds it in India, whether he finds it in the US or Europe or somewhere else, but he's happy to accept it, but he won't just uncritically accept anything. He'll think about things for himself. That's what makes him a cosmopolitan. Now, Chapter 1, it's called The Making of an Integral Advaitin, Vivekananda's Intellectual and Spiritual Tutelage under Sri Ramakrishna. So scholars have tended to underestimate the extent of Sri Ramakrishna's influence on Swami Vivekananda, and they haven't paid sufficient attention to the precise ways that Ramakrishna shaped his young disciples' thinking. So just to give one example, the British scholar Elizabeth de Michelis argues that the Brahmo leader, Keshab Chandra Sen, rather than Sri Ramakrishna, was the most influential role model for Vivekananda, and that Vivekananda's debt to the Brahmo Samaj cannot be overstated. So this first chapter challenges this scholarly orthodoxy by arguing that while the teenager Narendra was, that was Vivekananda's pre-monastic name. While Narendra was initially drawn toward the ideology of the Brahma Samaj, Sri Ramakrishna gave an entirely new orientation to Naren's intellectual and spiritual life in the course of their meetings between 1882 and 1886. And based on my study of the literature, especially the Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and also Leela Prasanga and other reliable texts, I've developed this argument that Sri Ramakrishna groomed Swamiji Vivekananda, the young Naren, in two phases. In that the first phase is from 1882, when he first starts visiting Sri Ramakrishna, to early 1884. And before he met Sri Ramakrishna, he was a follower of the Brahma Samaj. And the Brahma Samaj was a theistic movement, but it's a kind of enlightened theism. The idea is that they didn't believe in idol worship, but they believed in Saguna Brahman, the personal God, but without form. Nirakara, but Saguna Brahman. That was the deity that they worshipped. And then he met Sri Ramakrishna, and from the very beginning of his encounters with Sri Ramakrishna encouraged Naren to accept traditional Advaita Vedanta. And I'm not going to mention the famous incidents, but you know that. I think the second time that he met him in Dokineshwar, he touched him on the chest, and he went into a state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and then said, "What about my parents?" And so that was his first Advaitic spiritual experience. But there are many others, and then there's also at that time Sri Ramakrishna asked Naren to study Advaitic texts like the Ashtavakra Samhita, which I believe Sarvapriyananda teaches you guys. And so in that first phase, he weaned Vivekananda away from Brahmotheism to traditional Advaita Vedanta. But then there's a second phase. And this phase, I think the second phase has been neglected, not just by scholars, but by a lot of devotees. The second phase is from 1884 to 1886. And I call it the transition in Naren's thinking and his spiritual development from acosmic Advaita to integral Advaita. Acosmic would be the kind of English term for ajata, which means it's an Advaita, it's the Advaita taught by Shankara and his followers, encapsulated in the teaching Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Sri Ramakrishna gradually led Naren to reject the world-negating and quietistic outlook of traditional Advaita Vedanta, so Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. This is a phrase that Sri Ramakrishna himself uses a lot in the gospel to characterize the Jnani's standpoint, the Jnani being the traditional Advaita Vedanta, in favor of a more expansive and ethically oriented Advaitic philosophy, according to which the static non-dual Brahman, so Nirguna Brahman, is inseparable from the dynamic personal Shakti, which actually manifests as everything in this world. So this is my own way of kind of succinctly trying to capture what I call the integral Advaita philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. So the ultimate reality is not just Nirguna Brahman, but it's inseparable from Shakti, the personal God. Sri Ramakrishna would often teach Brahma or Shakti Abhed in Bangla, which means Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. So that's the first part. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Jagat is not Mithya, it's not ultimately non-existent, but it's actually a real manifestation of Shakti. And if any of you are familiar with the literature on the great monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, this should remind you of the final words of Swami Turiyanandaji. His final words were Brahma Shotto, Jagat Shotto, Shabi Shotto, Shotte Pran Pratisthito in Bangla, which means Brahman is true, the world is true, everything is true, life itself is grounded in truth, in reality. And interestingly, this is not, I just gave a lecture actually in the Mysore Ashrama, which is on YouTube, called Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, the spiritual evolution of Swami Turiyanandaji. So if you're interested in Turiyanandaji's evolution, you can look at that lecture. But he, interestingly, after he encounters Sri Ramakrishna, he also undergoes this very interesting transition from traditional Advaita to integral Advaita. And if you look at the gospel carefully, you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna actually teaches Naren. He says, after the state and beyond the state of Jnana, which is the state of the knowledge of non-dual Brahman and Nirvikalpa Samadhi, comes Vijnana. And Vijnana is something which if any of you have seen my previous lecture in the New York Vedanta Society, it's something I strongly emphasize. The Vijnani realizes that the ultimate reality is not just Nirguna, but also Saguna, and that Shakti has become everything in this universe. And so there's a famous incident when Naren tells Sri Ramakrishna, I just want to immerse myself in Nirvikalpa Samadhi and just forget about this entire world. And then Sri Ramakrishna scolds him and says, I thought you would be like a great banyan tree, giving shade to thousands, but now I see you only care about your own salvation. So here in that incident and many other places, Sri Ramakrishna is pushing him away from this world-denying kind of traditional Advaita Vedanta and toward the integral Advaita, which Sri Ramakrishna himself taught, which I also call Vijnana Vedanta. So chapter 2, it's called The Deification of the World. This is a quotation taken from his lecture, God and Everything. The metaphysics and ethics of oneness in Vivekananda's integral Advaita. So this is a very long and detailed chapter. It's over 20,000 words. And in this chapter, I attempt to tackle this very difficult scholarly question. What exactly is the nature of Swamiji's Vedantic philosophy? So the key question, how should we interpret Vivekananda's Vedantic philosophy? The first thing that nobody can dispute is that he championed Advaita Vedanta. I'm not disputing that. Nobody can dispute it because it's, if you just open to any page in the complete works, you're going to find he's talking about Advaita Vedanta most of the time. But nonetheless, that doesn't actually solve the major scholarly question or the problems. There are two key interpretive questions regarding the precise nature of Vivekananda's Advaita philosophy. These are questions asked repeatedly by scholars, and different scholars have different approaches to answering these questions. Number one, to what extent, if at all, does Swamiji's Advaita philosophy differ from the traditional Advaita Vedanta of the 8th century Shankaracharya and his followers? That's the first question. The second major scholarly question is, what is the precise relationship between Swamiji's Advaita Vedanta and the philosophical worldview of his guru, Sri Ramakrishna? That's a separate question, actually. And different scholars have answered these questions different ways. The most common answer to the first question about Swamiji vis-a-vis Shankara is that Swamiji followed Shankara's Advaita Vedanta in all of its essentials. So I just gave a few examples of scholars who adopt that view. Satprakashananda, Omkarananda, TMP Mahadeva, Nalini Devdas, Frida Matchett, Walter Neville, and many others. And scholars have given two conflicting answers to the second question. Remember, the second question is, how does Swamiji's philosophy relate to his guru Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? The first answer that some scholars give is there is a continuity between Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna in that both of them followed Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. So scholars like Omkaranandaji, Dhireshanandaji, and Mahadevan, they argue for this position. Sri Ramakrishna followed Shankara's Advaita. Swamiji also followed Shankara's Advaita. The second answer to the second question about Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji is that there's a discontinuity, a philosophical discontinuity between the philosophy of Vivekananda and the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna. So scholars who adopt this view are Nalini Devdas, Frida Matchett, and Walter Neville. What they claim is that Sri Ramakrishna taught a world-affirming monistic philosophy that comes closer to Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism than to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. But Swami Vivekananda deviated from his guru Sri Ramakrishna in teaching an ultimately world-negating philosophy based on Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. So this is an overview, a very sketchy overview of the existing scholarly literature on Swamiji's philosophy. And what I try to do in chapter 2 is defend a new approach to Swamiji's philosophy. So what I argue is that the Advaita Vedanta taught by Swamiji is not Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, but the integral Advaita, or another term for it is Vijnana Vedanta, taught to him by his guru Sri Ramakrishna. And some scholars before me who have argued for a similar position are Swami Tapasanandaji, Satish Chandra Chatterjee, and Jeffrey Long, who has spoken several times, I think, in the Vedanta Society of New York. So I'm sort of following in their footsteps, but also sort of entering into uncharted territory in certain respects, which I'll explain. So on my interpretation, Vivekananda's philosophy of integral Advaita upholds an all-inclusive divine oneness that encompasses not only the impersonal Brahman, but also the dynamic Shakti, as well as the entire universe of sentient and insentient entities. So integral, the word integral means all-inclusive or kind of comprehensive. It's a oneness that's all-inclusive. And Sri Ramakrishna very succinctly explains the integral Advaitic view. In 1885, this is from the Kathamrita, he says, these three, Brahman, the insentient world, Jagat, and living beings, Jivas, together constitute one reality, Shab Jodiye Ekti. Everything combined is one reality. This is how I explain integral Advaita. So again, in the formula that I gave earlier, we can encapsulate the integral Advaita of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji as Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. So that's what I try to explain in great detail. But an obvious objection comes up. to this kind of approach to Swamiji, this integral Advaitic approach to Swamiji. The objection is, but wait a minute, if you read the complete works, you're going to find that he often appealed to traditional Advaitic doctrines, including impersonality, so Nirgunatva, Maya, Vivartavada, and the ontological distinction between Paramatika, the ultimate, and Vyavaharika, relative or empirical levels of reality. So why does he appeal to that? If he doesn't follow Shankara, why does he use Shankara's concepts? So my argument is, it's a very good question. And my argument is that Swamiji, no doubt, uses Shankara's terminology, but he subtly reconceptualized these traditional Advaitic doctrines from the standpoint of the integral Advaita taught to him by Sri Ramakrishna. So I think, and this is something I argue for in the second chapter, but I think that Swamiji was reluctant to start a new sect. He said that in certain places. Sri Ramakrishna didn't come to start a new sect. He said that again and again. At the same time, he said, but how do we characterize our ideology, the Ramakrishna ideology? It's a non-sectarian sect. So this is kind of paradoxical, right? So he doesn't want it to be a sect, but at the same time, he knows that it has certain distinctive and unique features. And this is, I take integral Advaita to be the non-sectarian sect that I think Swamiji taught, but that he didn't want it to be radically new. He didn't want to say that I'm breaking with the existing tradition. He said, I'm following the tradition. I'm following the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, but I'm giving a new twist to some of the key doctrines of the Advaitic tradition. That's how I see Swamiji explaining this integral Advaita. So briefly, Swamiji followed Sri Ramakrishna in holding the following four doctrines. The impersonal Brahman and the personal Shakti are equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality. I give lots of evidence from the complete works to support this view that he very strongly follows his guru Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, taught Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. 2, the universe is a real manifestation of Shakti. 3, all four yogas, Bhakti Yoga, Dhyana Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga, are direct and independent paths to salvation. And 4, different world religions are equally capable of leading to salvation. So these are 4 of the main doctrines of what I'm calling Swamiji's integral Advaita. Chapter 3. It's called Grounding Religious Cosmopolitanism, 3 phases in the evolution of Vivekananda's doctrine of the harmony of religions. So most scholars, when they talk about Swamiji's views on the harmony of religions, they say that even though he claims that he accepts all world religions and they're all equally valid, in fact, if you look carefully at the way that he explains the harmony of religions, it turns out to be hierarchical, since he holds that theistic religions, so religions based on bhakti, devotion, are lower stages on the way to the highest standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. So a few of the scholars who adopt this critical standpoint are Paul Hacker, R.W. Neufeld, Wilhelm Hauptfass, who was, by the way, the supervisor of Swami Atmagyananandaji when he was a PhD student in Sanskrit at the University of Pennsylvania, and Stephen Gregg, among others. So they say that Vivekananda actually was a kind of Advaitic, hierarchical inclusivist, in that he held Advaita on a higher footing. And he didn't reject other religions, but he put them on a lower footing. By contrast, in chapter 3, I argue that while Swamiji did hold this hierarchical Advaitic position for a brief period, for about 9 months, from 1894 to 1895, he later abandoned this position in favor of a non-hierarchical doctrine of the harmony of religions taught to him by Sri Ramakrishna, by his guru. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to discuss phase 1, which was from September 1893 when he gave the speeches at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, to March 1894. It's important, it's just I don't have the time to go through all of them, so I'm going to skip right to phase 2. Phase 2, September 1894 to May 1895. In this period, Swamiji did in fact subscribe to Advaitic inclusivism, grounding his doctrine of the harmony of religions in the 3 stages of Dvaita, dualism, Vishishtha Advaita, qualified non-dualism, and Advaita, non-dualism. Now, inclusivism is a technical term used in Western philosophy of religion, which means it's the view that my religion is the highest religion. Other religions are not wrong, but they're lower. They're lower stages leading up to my highest religion. Eventually, everybody will have to come up to my standpoint, and then they can attain salvation, basically. So this was a position that I think he adopted for about 9 months, between 1894 and 1895. But for the remainder of his life, from late 1895 all the way to the end of his life, he abandoned this Advaitic inclusivist approach in favor of the pluralist view that every world religion corresponds to at least one of the 4 yogas, each of which is a direct and independent path to salvation. And again, I'm using the word pluralism in a technical sense. Pluralism, in contrast to inclusivism, is the view that multiple world religions are equally capable of leading to salvation. There's no higher and lower. All the religions are placed on an equal footing. So that's the position that I think Swamiji ultimately accepts and teaches all the way from 1895 to 1901. So let me just explain these 2 phases briefly. Phase 2, September 1894 to May 1895. This is what I characterize as his Advaitic inclusivist period. So he harmonized the world religions on the basis of the 3 stages of Vedanta: Dvaita, Vishtadvaita, and Advaita. As far as I'm aware, I did a pretty careful study of the complete works, and this is what I found. In only 4 lectures and writings, and they're these 4: the reply to the Madras Address, it's an essay written in September 1894, the lecture Religions of India, the lecture Soul, God, and Religion, and a letter to his disciple Alasinga Perumal, dated 6th May 1895. And to give you a little taste of what that position is, I'm going to just give a quotation from this letter to his disciple Alasinga. He wrote this in 6th May 1895. All of religion is contained in the Vedanta, that is, in the 3 stages of the Vedanta philosophy, the Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Advaita. One comes after the other. These are the 3 stages of spiritual growth in man. Each one is necessary. This is the essential of religion. The Vedanta, applied to the various ethnic customs and creeds of India, is Hinduism. The first stage, i.e. Dvaita, applied to the ideas of the ethnic groups of Europe, is Christianity. As applied to the Semitic groups, Mohammedanism. The Advaita, as applied in its yoga perception form, is Buddhism, etc. So I think it's very clear here that during this period, this is the last of a text that I'm aware of where he adopts this Advaitic inclusivist approach. He says clearly, the different world religions correspond to one of the 3 stages of Vedanta, either Dvaita or Vishtadvaita or Advaita. Advaita is the highest, but devotional religions like Christianity and Islam, they belong to the lowest stage, the stage of Dvaita. So he's clearly not putting all the world religions on an equal footing at that point in his thinking. So between September 1894 and May 1895. Now, what happens in the 3rd phase? Beginning late 1895 and up to 1901, he completely changes the way that he teaches the harmony of religions. And I don't think any scholar has noticed this. What most scholars have done is they've generalized that phase 2 and taken that to be his overall position, but I think that's a real mistake. This is his mature view, this phase 3. So after May 1895, he never again appealed to the 3 stages of Vedanta in the specific context of the harmony of religions. So that italicized phrase is very important, because if you open the complete works, you'll find that in the lectures from Colombo to Almora, which are 1897 for the most part, he does talk about the 3 stages of Vedanta. So it's not that he stopped talking about the 3 stages after 1895, but he never taught the harmony of religions on the basis of the 3 stages starting in late 1895. So just please note that nuance. Instead, in his lectures and writings from late 1895 to 1901, Swamiji consistently taught the harmony of all religions on the basis of a Vedantic universal religion grounded in the 4 yogas. So this is one quotation taken from one of these lectures from that last period. The grandest idea in the religion of Vedanta is that we may reach the same goal by different paths. And these paths I have generalized into 4, namely those of work, karma yoga, love, bhakti yoga, psychology, raja yoga, and knowledge, jnana yoga. We have found that in the end, all these 4 paths converge and become one. All religions and all methods of work and worship lead us to one and the same goal. So what is his main argument? His argument proceeds in 2 steps. First step in his argument, he claims that every world religion corresponds to at least one of the 4 yogas. This is from his lecture, My Master, which is on his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. He says, a man may be intellectual or devotional or mystic or active. The various religions represent one or the other of these types. Okay, so every religion corresponds to one of these 4 yogas. Second step in his argument, each of the 4 yogas is equally effective in leading to salvation. He says it very clearly. This is from Raja Yoga. Each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect, even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, karma yoga, of wisdom, jnana yoga, and of devotion, bhakti yoga, are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. So combining these two steps in the argument is fairly simple. Since each of the 4 yogas is equally effective in leading to salvation, and each of the major world religions corresponds to at least one of these 4 yogas, all of these world religions are equally effective in leading to salvation. And along those lines, he says in the same My Master lecture, each religion has the same saving power as the other. So it's very clearly non-hierarchical at this stage. He's no longer saying that Advaita is higher than the devotional religions. He's putting them all on equal footing. And he says that even through devotional religions, you can attain the highest goal. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm because I have limited time, I'm moving on. So remember that, the first 3 chapters comprise part 1, which is on the theme of integral Advaita. So chapters 4 through 6 concern the experiential basis of religion. And chapter 4 is called The Science of Religion, Vivekananda's critique of scientism and his defense of the scientific credentials of religion. So in this chapter, I examine Vivekananda's doctrine of what he calls the science of religion, which is a term he refers to at least 13 times in the complete works. It's a very interesting doctrine. And on my understanding, his doctrine of the science of religion has both a negative and a positive dimension. The negative dimension is a critique of scientism. And I'll just explain in a second what I mean by scientism. And the positive dimension of Swamiji's science of religion is his attempt to defend the scientific credentials of religion, defending religion as a rigorous science. So the negative dimension first. What is scientism and why does he criticize it? So he criticizes 3 forms of scientism. All these different forms are discussed by contemporary philosophers of science, actually. So the first is what I call the popular understanding of scientism. We can abbreviate it PS for popular scientism. Science, this is a philosopher named Samir Okasha. Science worship, the over-reverential attitude towards science found in many intellectual circles. So you'll find in the complete work, Swamiji referring to the popes of modern science. And he would often use very sarcastic language to talk about how science has gained so much prestige that people just blindly swallow whatever scientists say without realizing that scientists themselves have revised their views every few years. So that's the first kind of criticism he makes. The second kind of scientism that Swamiji criticizes is called ontological scientism. We can abbreviate it OS, the view that the only entities that exist are those that are discoverable through the natural sciences, so biology, chemistry, physics, etc. Third kind of scientism, which he criticizes, is called epistemological scientism, ES, the view that only the natural sciences deliver genuine knowledge and that religion cannot be a basis of knowledge. Spiritual experience cannot give us knowledge, only science can give us knowledge because science is based on sense experience, which is the only source of knowledge. Now, regarding the positive dimension of Swamiji's science of religion, remember, how does he defend religion as a science? That's what the positive dimension is. So I'm giving a little bit of historical background to understand what he's doing here. For Swamiji, the combined forces of scientific advancement, critical thinking, and globalization had precipitated nothing less than a global crisis of religious belief. Remember that in the 1850s, Charles Darwin published Origin of Species, explaining the theory of evolution. That made Christian theologians apoplectic, and they became extremely worried about the status of religion in the face of kind of new scientific developments. 1860, the British scientist Thomas Henry Huxley, whom Swamiji refers to in many places in the complete works, he remarked that extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes beside that of Hercules. So that's actually pretty representative of many intellectuals during Swamiji's time. They felt that with the development and advancement of the natural sciences, religion had almost no ground to stand on. The rug was being pulled out of religion. In the context of this global crisis of faith, of religious faith, Vivekananda argued that religion was a rigorous science grounded not in dogma, but in direct experience. And to this end, he defended what I call a wide empiricism, the view that experience is the primary source of knowledge, but that the category of experience encompasses both sensory experience, the experiences of the 5 senses, and supersensuous experience. And according to Swamiji, while sensory experience is the basis of the natural sciences like physics and chemistry and biology, supersensuous experience is the basis of the science of religion. So this is his main argument for defending religion as a rigorous science. But then comes a very important question. The key question is, well, okay, but in order to accept Swamiji's wide empiricism, supersensuous experience has to be a source of knowledge in the first place. But why should we accept that supersensuous experience is a source of knowledge? That's a really deep and controversial question. It's certainly not something that should be taken for granted. Many scholars, in fact, have claimed that Swamiji has no good answer to this question. They claim that Swamiji simply dogmatically asserts that spiritual experience, that supersensuous experience, is a form of knowledge. So I'll just give you two examples. C. Mackenzie Brown, he says, for Vivekananda, personal experiences of sages like Kapila are accepted as infallible without critical assessment of such experiences, without awareness that experiences are largely inseparable from personal and cultural interpretation. So he assumes that Swamiji just kind of accepts the veridicality, the authenticity of spiritual experiences of sages like Sri Ramakrishna and Kapila. Another scholar, Anantanand Rambachan, who's based in the US, he also claims that Vivekananda wrongly conceives religion as a science. Why is he wrong? Because spiritual experiences are not an objective source of knowledge. And he has an entire chapter devoted to arguing against Swamiji's understanding of religion as a science. And I'll get to that in a little bit. I argue in chapter 5 and in chapter 6 that what these scholars have overlooked is Swamiji's sophisticated argument for the epistemic value of supersensuous perception. I abbreviate this AEV, which I reconstruct and further develop in chapter 5. What does epistemic value mean? It's a fancy term. It just means he's providing an argument, a philosophical argument for why spiritual experience, otherwise known as supersensuous perception, why spiritual experience is a source of knowledge. How can that deliver knowledge? Why should we believe that it can give us knowledge? So what is the argument? It's very complicated, and I have a long chapter on this. I'm not going to go into all the technicalities, but I wanted to give a general sense. His argument turns on two key principles. And the first principle I call the principle of perceptual proof, which we can abbreviate PP. This is a quotation from one of his lectures. What is the proof of God? Direct perception, pratyaksha. The proof of this wall is that I perceive it. God has been perceived that way by thousands before and will be perceived by all who want to perceive him. But this perception is no sense perception at all. It is supersensuous, superconscious. So this is how I understand the reasoning behind this kind of passage. He says these things in many places, but this is one of the important passages. So I take him to be arguing as follows. We ordinarily take our sense perceptions to be proof that what we perceive actually exists. So he gives a very common example. The proof of this wall is that I perceive it. I believe that there's a wall in front of me because I perceive a wall. I'm actually seeing the wall. It's very simple. This everyday behavior is justified on the basis of the following general epistemic principle. Again, this is a direct quotation from Raja Yoga. Whatever we see and feel is proof if there has been nothing to delude the senses. Let us call this Swamiji's principle of perceptual proof. So hereafter PP. And this is a more technical way of formulating what he just said. In the absence of reasons for doubting the veridicality of my perception, all that veridicality means is that my perception actually makes contact with an objective reality. My perception of X, and X is just any object, any entity. My perception of X makes it reasonable for me to believe that X exists. So if I am justified in believing that there is a wall in front of me because I perceive that wall, I am equally justified in believing that God exists because I perceive God. This is the first principle in his argument. The second principle is what I call the principle of testimonial proof, abbreviated TP. This is a quotation also taken from Raja Yoga. Aptavakya, the direct evidence of the yogis, of those who have seen the truth. The yogis, words are proof because he sees knowledge in himself. These yogis, for instance, are the authors of the sacred scriptures. Therefore, the scriptures are proof. If any such persons are living now, their words will be proof. So what Swamiji says is that the testimony of an apta, a credible person, about her perception, his or her perception of some entity, constitutes proof for others that that entity exists. So that's what I'm calling his principle of testimonial proof, TP. This is a technical formulation of it. In the absence of reasons for doubting the speaker's trustworthiness, it is reasonable for me to believe the speaker's perceptual testimony. And why should we accept this principle? For the same reason that we should accept the previous principle, the principle of perceptual proof, because it's absolutely indispensable in our day-to-day lives. Everybody relies on both of these principles all the time. Let me give you one example. I'm new to a particular town. I'm trying to get to a grocery store. I don't know how to get there. What do? I see somebody who seems like a local. I ask that person for directions. That person says, oh, go straight, then take a left, then take a right, go 1 mile, and then you'll find the grocery store. What do I do? Do I first sort of investigate? Do I run a background check and see whether he's lying to me? No, I take for granted that he's telling me the truth, unless I have some good reason to doubt this person's testimony. So it's not just asking for directions. What about history books? What about newspapers? Everything is based on testimony, essentially. And we don't always, do background checks. In fact, most of the time we don't do background checks for those kinds of things. So Swamiji believed that both these principles, PP and TP, are both just self-evident, and that they're indispensable in just getting along in our day-to-day lives. Now, if we accept these two epistemic principles, PP and TP, then the words of a yogi who claims to have perceived a supersensuous reality constitute proof for others, so people other than the yogi, that supersensuous reality exists. This is what I think Swamiji is getting at in the previous passages that I quoted. So on the basis of the principle of testimonial proof, Vivekananda further claims that the scriptures are proof since aptas include the authors of the sacred scriptures. So he interprets the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and all the other great holy scriptures as just testimonial texts. They're texts testifying to the spiritual experiences of the great sages, basically, who composed those scriptures. And on the basis of these two epistemic principles, Swamiji concludes, there is knowledge beyond the senses, and whenever it does not contradict reason and past human experience, that knowledge is proof. So to sum up the argument, Swamiji argues that if we accept certain uncontroversial epistemic principles, namely the principle of perceptual proof and TP, the principle of testimonial proof, then it is reasonable for us to accept the testimony of credible mystics who claim to have perceived a supersensuous reality such as God or the soul. So this is his argument in a nutshell. I go into great detail in my chapter, but you'll have to read the chapter to get the details. Now, chapter 6 it's following up from chapter 5. So after I lay out the main AEV, the argument for the epistemic value of supersensuous perception, I address various objections to Swamiji's appeal to supersensuous experience. I don't have the time here to discuss them. It's a very technical chapter, but I go all the way back to, for instance, Kumarila Bhatta, who was a Puvamamsaka, who argued against the validity of yogic perception. I consider many objections from the standpoint of contemporary Western epistemology. And at the end, in the last section of chapter 6, I address a very important book written on Swamiji's philosophy by Anantaran Rambachan called The Limits of Scripture, Vivekananda's reinterpretation of the Vedas. I just mentioned it briefly in an earlier slide, but now I want to go into it in a little bit more detail. I devote an entire section to kind of refuting his criticisms of Swamiji's attempt to defend the epistemic value of spiritual experience. And this is a quotation from Rambachan's book. He says, I have referred from time to time in this discussion to Vivekananda's attempts to equate the gain and verification of knowledge through Raja Yoga with the methods employed in science. The grounds, however, on which he draws his parallels leave many questions unanswered. Vivekananda's analogy with science is basically an analogy between religious experience and sense perception. The assumption is that both are verifiable in the same way. Almost all his examples, as well as his terminology, are drawn from the world of sense perception. There appear, however, to be very important differences between sensory experience and religious experience. So I should just mention, this is one of many arguments and criticisms that Rambachan develops in the course of his chapter. In order to get the full take and full representation of Rambachan's criticisms of Vivekananda's views and my refutation, you have to look at my book. So this is by no means a comprehensive discussion, but I just wanted to give a taste. First of all, how do I try to defend Swamiji's views on spiritual experience against Rambachan's criticisms? So first, let's try to understand what is Rambachan saying. According to Rambachan, Vivekananda argues for the scientific status of religion by establishing parallels between religious experience on the one hand and sense perception on the other. And this argument, according to Rambachan, is based on the assumption that both types of experience are verifiable in the same way. He thinks that Swamiji, Vivekananda, just takes for granted that both religious experience and sense perceptions are verifiable in the same way. Hence, Rambachan proceeds to point out some of the very important differences between sense experiences and religious experiences, Since Rambachan thinks that establishing these differences is sufficient to undermine Swamiji's case for the scientific credentials of religion. So this is one of his main arguments against Swamiji's views. And I argue in the final section of chapter 6 that Rambachan makes two serious mistakes. The first mistake is that Rambachan claims that Swamiji assumes that sensory experience and spiritual experience are both, quote, verifiable in the same way. But he doesn't give any evidence for this claim. And in fact, Swamiji explicitly denies this assumption, insisting rather that, quote, each science must have its own methods of verification. This is a direct quotation from Raja Yoga. So for Swamiji, the physical sciences and the science of religion share a common basis in experiential verification. But Swamiji argues that just as the methods for verifying claims in astronomy and chemistry differ, right? If I study astronomy, I'll use a telescope, for instance. When I study chemistry and I run experiments, I'm not using a telescope, I'm mixing chemicals, and right, I'm in a lab, I'm doing something different. I use microscope. The methods for verifying religious claims also differ quite naturally from verificatory methods in the other sciences. So every science has its unique methods of verification. This is something that I think Rambachan really seriously, he makes a mistake on that front. And the second big mistake that I think he makes, this is even more fundamental. Rambachan assumes that Swamiji's entire case for the scientific status of religion rests on establishing what he calls parallels between sense experience and religious experience. In fact, however, as I argued at length in chapter 5 of my book, Swamiji presents these parallels between sense experience and religious experience only in support of his broader argument for the epistemic value of spiritual experience. So that's what I abbreviated AEV, based on the two epistemic principles of the principle of perceptual proof and the principle of testimonial proof, so Rambachan, he doesn't even consider this argument because the argument is something that I had to reconstruct. It's not something that Swamiji gives systematically, you know, it's in a set of sentences. It's something that I had to I did a lot of research and kind of put together arguments found in different pages. And so I think he and every other scholar I'm aware of simply ignores or overlooks that AEV, that argument for the epistemic value of spiritual experience. And I think that's the most serious mistake he makes. So what I think Swamiji is claiming is that both sensory experiences and mystical experiences are perceptual in nature. They're both kinds of perception. That's all that he has to claim for the purposes of his argument. Then the two epistemic principles, PP and TP, kick in. And so the epistemic principles PP and TP would apply equally to all forms of perception, whether that's sensory perception, seeing, hearing, tasting, or supersensuous perception. That's also a form of perception. So perceiving supersensuous entities like God or the soul. And he is then able to defend the epistemic value of supersensuous perception on the basis of these two epistemic principles. So on my interpretation, Vivekananda's AEV, the argument for the epistemic value of spiritual experience, is the linchpin for establishing religion as a science based on direct experiential verification. And this is something that I think scholars have overlooked. So that's enough. I mean, there's a lot more that I could talk about, but I don't have the time. So chapter 7. So that covers, so chapters 4 through 6, as I mentioned, cover the second part of the book, which is called the experiential basis of religion. The third part of the book, which comprises chapters 7 and 8, concern faith and reason. And chapter 7 is called From Agnosticism to Meta-Agnosticism, Vivekananda's Kantian Vedantic critique of theological reason. So this chapter examines Swamiji's views on the powers and limits of theological reason. So how far can reason take us in thinking about the deep questions of life, the meaning of life? Does God exist? Those kinds of questions. Do we have an eternal soul? And he developed his views through a subtle cosmopolitan engagement with two groups of thinkers. On the Western side, with Kant, William Hamilton, Herbert Spencer, and John Stuart Mill. He read all of these philosophers when he was a student of philosophy at Scottish Church College in Kolkata. And on the Indian side, the philosophy of Nyaya, the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta of Shankara, and his guru Sri Ramakrishna. And he followed Sri Ramakrishna in holding that spiritual experience is the only authoritative means of knowing Brahman. And he also followed Vedanta, that includes Shankara, but also Ramanuja and the other Vedantic schools. So all the Vedantic schools agree on this. And he also followed the Kantian tradition, starting with Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. And he disagreed. He broke with the Nyaya rational theology tradition. So what rational theology which is the Nyaya view, is that they believe that you can actually provide really strong rational arguments for the existence of God. And they tried to present these different kinds of arguments. One of the most famous is the argument from design, which is also popular in the West. Swamiji said he just disagrees with the Nyayikas on this, and he sides with Vedanta and the Kanti tradition against Nyaya in rejecting the possibility of rational theology. So he says, reason can neither prove nor disprove the existence of supersensuous entities like God or the soul. So so I would call that a rational agnosticism. What I mean by that is reason alone cannot prove to us that God or the soul exists. But that's not where his position ends. That's why I call the chapter From Agnosticism to Meta-Agnosticism. It's a really interesting phrase that Swamiji uses in one of his lectures. At the same time, Swamiji criticized Kantian thinkers from a Vedantic standpoint, arguing that these Kantian thinkers were not justified in ruling out the possibility of supersensuous knowledge. So in a section of his lessons on Raja Yoga, given in 1896, and it's actually called, this lesson is called Meta-Agnosticism, Vivekananda clarified his dialectical stance toward the Kantian tradition. So this is a quotation from that lesson. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's quoting from Jesus. The word repent is in Greek metanoete. Meta means behind, after, beyond, and means literally go beyond knowledge. And notice how Swamiji glosses that, the knowledge of the five senses. So it's sensory knowledge. And look within where you will find the kingdom of heaven. So in other words, I think Swamiji followed Kantian thinkers in upholding rational agnosticism. Reason can neither prove nor disprove definitively the existence of supersensuous entities. But he faulted these Kantian thinkers for unjustifiably ruling out what he calls meta-agnosticism, the possibility of supra-rational knowledge. Supra means beyond. That's what he means by meta-agnosticism. Meta-agnosticism is go beyond the rational intellect and ascend to the plane of spiritual experiences, and you will then attain knowledge of eternal spiritual truths that you could never gain through any amount of rational argumentation and theorizing. This seemed to be Swamiji's position. I explain this in detail in chapter 7. And chapter 8, I discuss his views on faith. So chapter 7 focuses on his views on the limits and powers of reason. Chapter 8 focuses on his views on faith. I call it the will to realize, Vivekananda's doxastic involuntarism, and his three-rung ladder of religious faith. As far as I'm aware, no scholar has discussed Swamiji's views on religious faith in any depth, but he said some really interesting and original things about faith. That's what I argue in chapter 8. I argue that he made a unique intervention in late 19th century debates about faith and reason. So in a very famous essay called The Ethics of Belief, published in 1879, the Cambridge mathematician and philosopher W.K. Clifford defended a very stringent, a very narrow form of evidentialism. This is a very famous statement he made in that essay. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Both Clifford and Huxley, T.H. Huxley, this is Thomas Henry Huxley, whom Swamiji often refers to. Huxley was also an evidentialist, and they both rejected appeals to spiritual experience on this basis. They said, spiritual experience does not count as evidence because they're just subjective experiences. That doesn't have objective validity, so it doesn't count as evidence. Therefore, it's wrong to believe anything on the basis of your own spiritual experiences or the spiritual experiences of the great sages, the so-called great mystics or sages. This was the view of some of his contemporaries, W.K. Clifford and Huxley. And against the evidentialism of Clifford and Huxley, the Harvard philosopher William James, whom Swamiji met in 1896, William James argued in his classic essay, The Will to Believe. So you can see why the title of my chapter is The Will to Realize, because it's a play on James's, the title of his essay, so The Will to Believe. So in this essay, The Will to Believe in 1896, he argues that we are justified in having religious faith based not on sufficient evidence, as Clifford and Huxley claim, since James believed that the evidence is more or less even. It's about equal on both sides. The evidence for God's existence, the evidence against God's existence. He says it's a kind of moot debate, and it's very difficult to argue for either side in a strong way. So religious faith need not be based on sufficient evidence, but on the hope that religion is true, since the stakes are infinitely high. But keep in mind also, this is not a license to believe anything at all. The idea is that we have no good, there are no knockdown proofs against the existence of God and against religion. That's a very important part of it, right? So because there are no knockdown proofs against the existence of God, and the stakes are infinitely high, and if we do not believe, we lose the possibility of attaining the infinite good which religion promises. So this is a very sketchy summary of James's important essay, but I talk about it in more detail in my book. So now, that's the historical context, the late 19th century context. What does Swamiji do? He made a unique intervention in these late 19th century debates about faith and reason by steering a middle course between the narrow evidentialism of Clifford and Huxley on the one hand, and the anti-evidentialist position of William James on the other. And he does this on the basis of what I call an expanded evidentialism. So he was also an evidentialist, that's what I claim, like Clifford and Huxley, except that he was not a narrow evidentialist. He didn't believe that the only source of evidence is the testimony of our senses, but he argued that supersensuous perception and mystical testimony are valid sources of evidence that also support the rationality of religious belief. And so what he argues is that religious faith is grounded in the testimonial evidence of mystics who claim to have attained the direct supersensuous perception of God and the soul. So while Swamiji agreed with T.H. Huxley and W.K. Clifford that religious faith requires evidentialist justification, you should never believe anything unless you have sufficient evidence. That's what evidentialism means. But at the same time, he rejected their narrow form of evidentialism in favor of an expanded evidentialism that encompasses the evidence of both sense perception and supersensuous perception. And I also argue in the chapter, but I'm not going to explain this in detail, I think Swamiji almost certainly played a role in leading William James at Harvard to rethink his views on faith to a certain extent, and to emphasize probabilism and mystical evidentialism in his later work. So he wrote a couple essays on religious faith after his 1896 essay, The Will to Believe, where he starts claiming that actually mystical testimony, the testimony of different mystics across the world, make it more probable than not that religion is true. And this seems to be, I mean, I don't think it's coincidence that after 1896 and after meeting Swamiji and reading some of Swamiji's work, including Raja Yoga, that William James himself is teaching a kind of a different understanding of faith, actually, that comes closer to Swamiji's Vedantic position. So I argue, and this is something that most scholars have ignored, but the way that Swamiji might have influenced William James's understanding of faith. And then in the remainder of the chapter, I argue that Swamiji had a very original view of religious faith as proceeding in 3 stages. It's what I call his 3-rung ladder of religious faith. He made a number of remarks about religious faith in different lectures and writings, primarily from 1896, but there are also some from earlier years. And through a reconstruction of his different statements, I argue that his various remarks hint at a 3-rung ladder of faith. These are the 3 stages of religious faith for sincere spiritual aspirants. The first stage, I assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. It's intellectual assent. Stage 2, I believe that God exists. So notice that intellectual assent is a lower epistemic state than belief in God. And third, the third and final stage, I know with absolute certainty that God exists since I have directly realized God. So the goal, the culmination of faith is to have direct knowledge of God, where you can no longer doubt that God exists. So I want to just briefly explain these 3 stages. So the first stage, faith as intellectual assent. Swamiji does something quite radical here, because most people, when you hear religious faith, you assume that, oh, faith just means, what does it mean to have religious faith? It means that you believe in God. Swamiji says, no, that's the wrong understanding of religious faith. He rejects the common equation of religious faith with religious belief. And in fact, he argues that religious faith typically begins not with belief, but with what he calls intellectual assent. And this is a quotation. This is one great idea to learn and to hold on to, this idea of realization. Only the man who has actually perceived God and soul has religion. There is no real difference between the highest ecclesiastical giant who can talk by the volume and the lowest, most ignorant materialist. We are all atheists. Let us confess it. Mere intellectual assent does not make us religious. Not 1 in 20 millions is a real Christian. He claims that the vast majority of people in the world who profess to be religious believers, so many people say they're religious, but he says, in fact, they are atheists. Because what he means by atheists is that people who don't believe that God exists. And he says, even these so-called religious people, they don't believe that God exists. What they do is they have intellectual assent. They merely assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. And he puts intellectual assent on a lower footing than actual belief. What is Swamiji's justification for distinguishing between what he calls intellectual assent and belief? His main argument is that one who believes that F, right, some proposition that God exists, for instance, that F exists, feels strongly inclined to act and behave in accordance with the existence of F. If I believe that God exists, my whole life should be transformed, and I should be living on a day-to-day basis, on a moment-to-moment basis, as if God exists, as if God alone is the ultimate reality. By contrast, according to Swamiji, one who merely assents intellectually to the existence of some entity F, like God, but does not believe that F exists, tends to act and behave as if F does not exist. Accordingly, Swamiji rather startlingly declares that most so-called religious believers throughout the world are in fact religious atheists. It's a very striking phrase, religious atheists, in that they act and behave no differently than atheists do. For Swamiji, one can infer what a person believes from observing how that person lives. In the following passage from his lecture, Preparatory and Supreme Bhakti Yoga from 1896, he explains the second stage of religious faith and the conditions necessary for ascending from the first to the second stage. He says, as soon as a man begins to believe there is a God, he becomes mad with longing to get to him. Others may go their way, but as soon as a man is sure that there is a much higher life than that which he is leading here, as soon as he feels sure that the senses are not all, that this limited material body is as nothing compared with the immortal, eternal, undying bliss of the self, he becomes mad until he finds out this bliss for himself. And this madness, this thirst, this mania is what is called the awakening to religion. And when that has come, a man is beginning to be religious. But it takes a long time. All these forms and ceremonies, these prayers and pilgrimages, these books, bells, candles, and priests are the preparations. They take off the impurities from the soul. And when the soul has become pure, it naturally wants to get to the mine of all purity, God himself. So according to Swamiji, our beliefs tend to be reflected in our behavior. So if we really believe that God exists, we would act and think in accordance with this belief and exert our utmost efforts to realize God for ourselves. We would be, quote, mad with longing to get to God, to realize God. And of course, Swamiji was well aware that by this criterion, there are very few religious believers in the world, in spite of the fact that, as we already noted, that there, in the previous slide, that there are countless people who, for self-serving reasons, confuse intellectual assent with religious beliefs. So most people like to think that they believe in God, but in fact, they occupy the first stage of faith. They assent intellectually to God, to the existence of God, but they don't believe in God. That's the fact of the matter. Indeed, in another lecture, Swamiji himself mentions that his guru, Sri Ramakrishna, used to say that not 1 in 20 millions in this world believed in God. This is another startling statement. Most people don't believe in God. Even so-called religious people don't believe in God. For Swamiji, then, there are very few people in the world who have made the ascent from the first to the second stage of religious faith. In the passage quoted earlier in the previous slide, Swamiji also explains how belief in God eventually arises. Sincere spiritual aspirants who do not yet believe in God, so those who are still at the first stage of ascent, intellectual ascent, who do not yet believe in God, practice various spiritual disciplines, sadhanas, such as forms and ceremonies, prayers and pilgrimages, japa dhyana, which take off the impurities from the soul. And once the sadhaka's mind becomes sufficiently purified through such spiritual practices in the course of many births, the belief in God arises spontaneously, which means nobody can voluntarily ascend from stage 1 of intellectual ascent to stage 2 of belief. It's not voluntary. In contemporary epistemology, in Western philosophy, there's a concept called Doxastic Voluntarism, which means the view that we can just adopt beliefs at will. I just want to believe, let's say I want to believe suddenly that the capital of India is Lucknow. It's not true, right? Can you really just will yourself into believing that the capital of India is Lucknow? No, right? So in the same way, Swamiji says that you can't just decide to believe that God exists. That's not the way that belief works in the first place. So he rejects what contemporary epistemologists call doxastic voluntarism. The opposite of that view is doxastic involuntarism. So that's the view that I think Swamiji holds. With respect to the first stage of religious faith, so the stage of intellectual assent, Swamiji maintains that we can choose whether or not to assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. That is voluntary. I can decide whether or not to assent intellectually to the existence of God. However, Swamiji holds that belief in God's existence is not voluntary, it's involuntary. We cannot just choose to believe in God's existence. That's not the way that belief works. Hence, we cannot voluntarily ascend from the first stage of sub-doxastic ascent, which means sub-belief. It's a stage below belief, to the second stage of belief. Nonetheless, what we can do at the first stage of religious faith is to engage voluntarily in sadhanas, spiritual disciplines, which will purify our minds, thereby preparing the necessary conditions for the spontaneous arising of the belief that God exists, which is not under our direct control. So this is a rough overview. And finally, if we continue with our spiritual practices, by God's grace, we attain belief in God. Ultimately, what happens is, well, first I should say, so for Swamiji, as soon as a person begins to believe in God, she is consumed with a longing to realize God. Such a spiritual aspirant's sincere longing for God, when it becomes sufficiently intense, results by God's grace in the direct realization of God, the third and culminating stage of religious faith. And he describes this culminating stage of faith in his lecture Realization, given in 1896, delivered in London. If you have seen a certain country and a man forces you to say that you have not seen it, still in your heart of hearts, you know you have. So when you see religion and God in a more intense sense than you see this external world, nothing will be able to shake your belief. Then you have real faith. So he claims that the culmination of faith must be spiritual realization. Finally, chapters 9 and 10 comprise part 4, which concerns consciousness. As I mentioned, the really hot question now, the hot problem in philosophy of mind is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. That problem is actually formulated in a number of different ways, but this is one simple way of thinking about it. Where does conscious experience come from? And why does conscious experience exist at all? So this is HPC in short, the hard problem. And it was the term hard problem, the phrase hard problem consciousness was coined by David Chalmers, a professor at New York University, but he was by no means the first to have raised that problem in the first place. Sri Aurobindo had raised it much earlier. Swamiji himself did, as I show in my chapter. And even before Swamiji, John Tyndall, the Irish physicist whom Swamiji sometimes mentions, he raised the hard problem of consciousness over a century before David Chalmers. And I give a quotation. It became a famous quotation, which people like William James quoted in their own writings. Contemporary philosophers of mind have begun to take interest in the position called panpsychism, which is the view that everything is in some sense conscious. And one interesting form of panpsychism is called cosmopsychism, the view that there is a single cosmic consciousness from which all individual conscious experiences, your conscious experience, my conscious experience, the dog's conscious experience, from which all individual conscious experiences derive. And what I claim is that Swamiji defended what I call a panentheistic cosmopsychism by drawing on aspects of the philosophies of Sankhya, Advaita Vedanta, and Sri Ramakrishna. So according to what I'm calling his panentheistic cosmopsychism, the sole reality, this is what makes his view an integral Advaita. The sole reality, there's only one reality. What is that reality? It's divine consciousness. But that divine consciousness manifests as everything in this universe. This is a quotation from his lecture, The Cosmos, the Microcosm. We now see that all the various forms of cosmic energy, such as matter, thought, force, intelligence, and so forth, are simply the manifestations of that cosmic intelligence, or as we shall call it henceforth, the Supreme Lord. Everything that you see, feel, or hear, the whole universe is his creation, or to be a little bit more accurate, is his projection, or to be still more accurate, is the Lord himself. It is he who is shining as the sun and the stars. He is the Mother Earth. He is the speech that is uttered. He is the man who is talking. He is the audience that is here. It is all he. So this, I think, really nicely encapsulates what I call his panentheistic cosmopsychism. There's one reality. That reality is divine consciousness. That divine consciousness manifests as absolutely everything in this world, both sentient and insentient. It looks like a very complicated diagram. It sort of is. I explain it in detail in my chapter. I'm not going to explain it in detail now, but he explains that the ultimate reality has two key aspects. The impersonal aspect, which we can call Nirguna Brahman, pure consciousness or the non-dual absolute. But that Nirguna Brahman is inseparable from cosmic consciousness. Cosmic consciousness is a term that Swamiji actually uses in several places. And he also calls it primal creative energy. The Sanskrit equivalent terms that he sometimes uses in his writings and letters are Mahat, Ishvara, and Shakti. And just as Sri Ramakrishna taught that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, Swamiji taught that Nirguna Brahman and Mahat Ishvara Shakti are inseparable but equally real aspects of the same infinite divine reality. And that Brahma Shakti manifests as, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, we have the jiva, the individual soul. And on the right-hand side, we have insentient entities. That individual soul is associated with what's called the antakarana, the internal organ, which is insentient. And that comprises the mind, manas, ego sense, ahankara, and the insentient intellect, the buddhi. And I'm not going to go into more detail, but the main point of this diagram is he's building on basically what's a Sankhyan cosmology, and then also adding aspects of Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, and combining it to explain his framework of panentheistic cosmopsychism. Divine consciousness has become absolutely everything in this universe, both the jivas and the jagat. And finally, the 10th and final chapter of my book is called Vivekananda's Justification of Panentheistic Cosmopsychism, Involution, Mystical Experience, and Grounding by Self-Limitation. So both chapters 9 and 10, this is just a warning, are some of the most technical chapters in my book. It's not for the faint of heart. So in this chapter, I reconstruct his arguments, his justification for panentheistic cosmopsychism. It's one thing to just say, this is what I believe is true. It's another thing to actually argue for that view. So this is what I try to reconstruct his main arguments. And I also try to explain how the single divine consciousness individuates into the varied conscious perspectives of humans and animals. And in this chapter, I claim that he provides two complementary arguments in favor of panentheistic cosmopsychism. The first argument is what I call the involution argument for panpsychism, which is based on the Sankhyan doctrine of Satkarya, the doctrine that an effect pre-exists in its material cause. You'll find that Swamiji, in many of his lectures, he talks about involution and evolution, that nothing can evolve unless it was previously involved. And so therefore, God must have been involved in this entire creation. So that's his involution argument for panpsychism. But interestingly, similar involution arguments were made by Western philosophers in his time, in the 19th century, like Clifford himself and like William James. And the second argument he makes for panentheistic cosmopsychism is based on two sub-arguments. Namely, the first is the argument for the epistemic value of supersensuous perception, which I discussed, as I mentioned, in chapter 5, AEV, and the argument from design, which is, as I said, a famous argument both in Nyaya philosophy, but also in Western philosophy. The idea is that, if you look at this world, it shows evidence that it's been designed by an intelligent creator. And I try to show that Swamiji defends the premises of both of these arguments, the involution argument and the second argument, through a cosmopolitan engagement with both Indian and Western thought. So I show how he engages with the ideas of his 19th century Western philosophical contemporaries and a lot of the different Indian traditions. And the most serious problem for cosmopsychism is what Miri al-Bahari calls the decombination problem. And another philosopher, Freya Matthews, calls it, I like this term better, the individuation problem. So this problem is, okay, if you believe in cosmopsychism, you have to explain how. How is it logically possible and coherent for a single divine consciousness to individuate into various human and non-human animal consciousnesses? So if God is the single divine consciousness, how is it that I have my own individual conscious experiences? How is it that you have separate, different conscious experiences? I don't share your conscious experience, you don't share my experiences, and we certainly don't share God's divine experiences, right? So how is it possible for the one divine consciousness to individuate into the many ignorant human and non-human animal consciousnesses? And I claim that Swamiji answers this question by providing an account of what I call grounding by self-limitation. Following his guru Sri Ramakrishna, Swamiji holds that the single impersonal personal divine consciousness manifests as everything in this universe by playfully limiting or veiling herself through the individuating principle of Maya. So here, Maya is not a principle of illusion, but a principle of individuation. It's through Maya that divine consciousness is able to individuate into the conscious experiences of different human and non-human animal consciousnesses. And in the last section of chapter 10, I bring Swamiji into dialogue with the contemporary philosopher of mind, Miri al-Bahari, who has recently defended what she calls a perennial idealist theory of consciousness derived from classical Advaita Vedanta. And I claim that Swamiji's panentheistic cosmopsychism has a number of strong philosophical advantages vis-a-vis her theory. So I know this was a mouthful and I've gone over an hour. I'd love to hear from you now. I just wanted to mention one more time that the book has not yet been published as a result of delays due to the pandemic, but it's going to be published in the US first by Oxford University Press on March 8th, 2022. And hopefully within a month or two, hopefully by April 19th. A South Asian edition of the book will be published in India for sale in South Asia, also by Oxford. So if you're interested in anything I've said here, then please do purchase the book. Thank you.
I was just thinking, when the first book came out on Sri Ramakrishna, I thought that if Iron Mars does not do one thing more in his life, he has done more than enough with that first book itself. But he did not stop there, luckily. He has produced this magnificent next book on Swami Vivekananda, which we are now all looking forward to reading. And he has now created the taste in us for a third book on the Holy Mother sometime in the future, definitely. And actually, I have requests, from monks telling me, tell Iron Mars to do something on the Holy Mother.
The only problem, let me just I'll say it very quickly, but the problem is with Sri Ramakrishna, we have the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, over 1,000 pages, Leela Prasanga. In the case of Swamiji, we have 9 volumes. In the case of Holy Mother, it's harder to find material, actually. There is material, but especially philosophical material. I think let's talk about crowdsourcing. So I'm asking each one of you, if you find interesting philosophical kind of teachings of Holy Mother that you think might be relevant, send them my way. And, because I really think, I don't think I can do it alone, to be honest. The task is formidable. Yeah.
Right. And you could consider reading her life also.
Yeah, of course. But the problem is with the philosophical study, the emphasis cannot be on the life. People have, it has to be on philosophical teachings, and it's tricky with philosophy from a philosophical standpoint, writing a whole book. Right now, I feel comfortable writing an article or two. But as I said, if you guys can convince me that there's enough material to write another book, I would be very happy to do it.
Sure, but I was thinking of Swami Vivekananda said about Sri Ramakrishna, he was content to live that life, wonderful life, and I read the meaning of that life. So if you could do something like that to Holy Mother's life, read the meaning.
No, it's interesting. I'll think about it. Yeah, it's extremely difficult. It's much more difficult in the case of Holy Mother than in the case of Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna. That's one thing I'll say. Sure. Yeah, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Diane, would you like to say?
Swamiji, if I may add, our profound thanks for this extraordinary talk, and by extension, clearly the work itself. And we can only hope and pray that it finds the wide readership it so clearly deserves. And again, it's lovely to see you. And I will add to what Swami said, Holy Mother.
Okay, let's see. By Holy Mother's grace alone, will I be able to write a book on her? So I'm putting the responsibility on her rather than on my shoulders.
And also thank you for being so generous in answering all of these questions. You've been very generous with your time.
They're very thoughtful questions. Thank you so much. Yeah. We should start. We should end with the mantra, I think so. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Paramastu.